Daniel Harper didn't wake up because of the thunder outside. It wasn't the storm shaking the old windows of Briarstone Manor, and it wasn't the freezing air crawling through the room like something alive. What pulled him out of sleep was the sound of metal scraping softly against wood somewhere near the bed. At first, his eyes stayed half closed, his body heavy with exhaustion after another long night inside that haunted house. But then he noticed something strange. The room felt wrong, completely still. No wind, no thunder, no breathing except his own. And when he finally opened his eyes, he saw her. Sophie was standing beside the bed, motionless, her pale face barely visible in the darkness, strands of hair hanging over her eyes, one hand gripping a large kitchen knife so tightly her knuckles looked white. The tip of the blade hovered inches from Daniel's throat. He froze instantly, every muscle in his body locked as panic crawled through his chest. For a second, he thought maybe she was sleepwalking. Maybe this was some kind of nightmare caused by stress, grief, or whatever darkness seemed to live inside that house. But then Sophie slowly tilted her head sideways in a way no child naturally should. And Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. She wasn't blinking. "She says you have to bleed first," Sophie whispered softly, though the voice coming from her mouth didn't sound human at all. At that exact moment, the grandfather clock downstairs began striking 3:13 a.m., and somewhere deep inside the walls of Briarstone Manor, something knocked back. Before we keep going, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because these supernatural horror stories only continue if people like you support them. And tell me in the comments, have you ever woken up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was watching you from the dark? 3 weeks earlier, the Harper family had never even heard of Briarstone Manor. Daniel only discovered the property existed after receiving a call about a distant relative who had died alone in the countryside outside Blackwood, Vermont. The inheritance didn't make sense at first. An enormous abandoned house, untouched for decades, left to a man who barely remembered that side of his family. But when you're drowning in debt, when the bills keep stacking higher every month, and your marriage feels like it's slowly suffocating under pressure, you stop asking questions, you start looking for escape routes. And for Daniel, that house felt like one. Emily tried to hide her discomfort the moment they arrived, but you could see it in her face as the moving truck disappeared down the dirt road, leaving them completely isolated beneath a sky so gray it almost looked unreal. The house stood at the top of Blackwood Hill like something forgotten by time itself. Massive, silent, watching. Even Lucas stopped smiling when he noticed all the dead trees surrounding the property. Only Sophie kept staring at the mansion with that strange, distant expression, almost like she recognized it somehow. Inside, Briarstone Manor smelled of wet wood, dust, and something older, something buried beneath the walls for far too long. Every floorboard creaked, every hallway seemed darker than it should have been. Emily tried to laugh it off, telling the kids the place only needed warmth and light. But the deeper they walked into the house, the colder it became. Daniel found old family portraits covered with black stains, as if someone had tried to burn the faces away. Upstairs, Sophie discovered deep scratches running across the wallpaper beside her bedroom door. Dozens of them, carved so violently they exposed the wood underneath. Then came the first thing nobody could explain. The grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly began ticking on its own despite being broken for years. One slow tick at a time echoing through the haunted house, while Lucas stared toward the dark end of the hallway and quietly asked, "Mom, who's the woman standing there?" Emily turned immediately after Lucas spoke, but the hallway behind them was empty, just darkness stretching endlessly toward the staircase, silent and cold in a way that didn't feel normal. Daniel forced a nervous laugh, the kind people use when they're trying to convince themselves everything is fine. But even he couldn't hide how uncomfortable the atmosphere inside Briarstone Manor had become. That first night, nobody really slept. The old house made noises constantly, soft footsteps above the ceiling, pipes groaning inside the walls, doors creaking open for no reason. Every sound carried through the darkness like the house itself was breathing around them. Around 2 in the morning, Emily woke up after hearing Lucas talking quietly in his room. At first, she smiled, assuming he was playing with toys instead of sleeping. But when she cracked the door open, her stomach dropped instantly. Lucas was sitting upright on the bed, staring into the corner of the room, whispering to someone hidden in the shadows. "She says the basement door should stay closed," he murmured softly. Emily flicked on the light so fast her hands shook, but the corner was empty. Lucas looked confused when she asked who he was talking to. The crying woman, he answered like it was the most normal thing in the world. The next morning, Sophie barely touched her breakfast. Dark circles had formed beneath her eyes overnight, and while Daniel talked about repairs the house needed, she sat quietly sketching strange symbols across an old notebook she didn't even own the day before. Twisted circles, long figures hanging from trees, black hollow eyes. Emily tried asking where she learned to draw things like that, but Sophie simply shrugged and whispered, "I see them when I close my eyes." Things only became worse after Max started acting strangely. The family dog suddenly refused to go near the basement hallway. Every time he approached it, his body stiffened, low growls vibrating deep in his throat, while he stared at the door like something on the other side was staring back. That same night, Daniel woke up again after hearing slow footsteps outside the bedroom. Not running, not pacing, just one heavy step at a time dragging across the hallway floor. He opened the door expecting to find Sophie sleepwalking, but instead he found muddy footprints leading toward the back door. And outside, standing motionless beneath the trees at 3 a.m., Sophie was staring directly into the forest, as if something out there was waiting for her. Daniel rushed across the yard, calling Sophie's name, his flashlight shaking in his hand while cold wind moved through the trees around Briarstone Manor. But the strangest part wasn't finding his daughter outside in the middle of the night. It was the expression on her face when he finally reached her. She didn't look scared, she looked mesmerized. Her eyes stayed locked on the forest ahead, as if she could see someone standing between the trees, waiting for her to come closer. "Sophie," Daniel whispered, grabbing her shoulder hard enough to pull her attention away. And the moment she blinked, she looked genuinely confused about how she got there. Back inside the house, Emily wrapped a blanket around her daughter, while Daniel tried convincing himself this was stress, exhaustion, maybe even trauma from the move. But deep down, something felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. Over the next 2 days, the supernatural activity inside the haunted house became impossible to ignore. Doors opened by themselves. The sound of crying echoed faintly through the walls late at night. Sophie's drawings became darker, more violent, filled with twisted human figures hanging from trees, while shadowy faces watched from underneath the ground. And through all of it, Max kept getting worse. The dog barked constantly at empty corners, scratched at the doors trying to escape, and one afternoon violently snapped at Sophie the second she touched him. Then came the storm. Rain hammered the windows so hard the entire house trembled beneath the thunder. Around midnight, the lights suddenly went out, and during the chaos nobody noticed Max had disappeared. Emily searched every room screaming his name, while Lucas cried uncontrollably. But Sophie just sat quietly on the staircase, staring into the darkness below. The next morning, Daniel took the flashlight and walked alone into the woods behind the property. The deeper he went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind, nothing. Then he saw it. Max hanging from a dead tree with a rope tied tightly around his neck, his body swinging slowly above the mud. Daniel nearly dropped the flashlight when he noticed the symbol carved beneath the dog in the dirt. The exact same symbol Sophie had been drawing for days. And surrounding the tree were dozens of small footprints pressed deep into the wet ground. Footprints that looked disturbingly similar to those of a child. Daniel didn't tell the family what he truly felt. When he saw those footprints around the tree, he couldn't. Because once you allow yourself to believe something evil is happening inside your own home, every shadow starts feeling alive. Every silence feels dangerous. And Briarstone Manor had become unbearably silent after Max died. The house no longer creaked the same way. It almost felt calmer, as if whatever haunted those halls had gotten exactly what it wanted. Emily noticed the changes in Sophie almost immediately. Her daughter barely slept anymore. Some nights, Emily would wake up and find Sophie standing motionless in the hallway, staring into the darkness downstairs for hours without moving. Other times, she would discover muddy footprints beside Sophie's bed, even though the windows were locked from the inside. But the worst part wasn't the sleepwalking or the terrifying drawings covering the walls of her room. It was the way Sophie looked at people now, like she was studying them, watching them too carefully. One evening during dinner, Lucas accidentally dropped his glass on the floor, and while Emily rushed to comfort him, Sophie started laughing softly under her breath, not like a child laughing at something funny. It sounded empty, wrong. Daniel slammed his hand against the table hard enough to stop everyone cold. But Sophie's expression never changed. She just kept staring at the broken glass, while whispering words nobody understood. Later that night, Emily entered Sophie's room and froze instantly. Hundreds of drawings covered the walls, black figures hanging from trees, women with twisted necks, human faces scratched out completely, and hidden among them was one image that made her stomach twist with fear. A picture of Daniel lying in bed, while a dark figure stood beside him holding a knife. Emily slowly turned toward Sophie, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor facing the corner of the room. "Sophie, who drew this?" she whispered. For several seconds, the girl didn't answer. Then, without turning around, she quietly said, "She watches us when we sleep." Emily felt chills spread through her entire body, because at that exact moment, another voice softly breathed from somewhere deep inside the room, especially him. The terrified mother spun around, searching the darkness, but nobody else was there. And when she looked back at Sophie again, her daughter was smiling at the wall, while tears slowly rolled down her cheeks, as if something inside Briarstone Manor was learning how to wear her like a mask. After that night, Daniel stopped pretending everything inside Briarstone Manor could be explained logically. He still tried to act strong for his family, but fear had already rooted itself deep inside him. You could see it every time he checked the locks before bed or paused after hearing footsteps upstairs when everyone was supposed to be asleep. The atmosphere inside the haunted house kept growing heavier, almost suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in around the Harper family. Even the air smelled different now, damp, rotten. Sometimes Emily swore she could smell soil coming from beneath the floorboards, as if the house had been built on top of something buried and forgotten. That night, rain hammered the windows harder than ever, while the old grandfather clock echoed through the hallway downstairs. Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep after everything that had happened to Sophie. Around him, the darkness felt unnaturally thick. Then came the sound, a slow metallic scrape cutting through the silence beside the bed. His eyes opened instantly. At first he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because standing only inches away from him was Sophie, completely still, her face hidden beneath strands of tangled hair, while one hand tightly gripped a large kitchen knife, reflecting flashes of lightning from outside the window. The blade hovered dangerously close to Daniel's throat. For one horrifying second, he truly believed his daughter was about to kill him. "Sophie," he whispered carefully, terrified that any sudden movement might trigger something inside her. But she didn't react normally. Her head slowly tilted sideways with a sharp, unnatural movement, while her lips stretched into a faint smile that didn't belong to a child anymore. Then she spoke. "She says you have to bleed first." The voice coming from Sophie sounded deep, distorted, almost layered with another presence speaking through her. At that exact moment, every light inside Briarstone Manor began flickering violently. The grandfather clock downstairs struck 3:13 a.m. Boom, boom, boom. And somewhere deep inside the walls, something started scratching from the inside, trying to get out. Daniel finally lunged forward to grab the knife, but the second he touched Sophie's arm, she unleashed a scream so violent and inhuman, it echoed through the entire house. Emily came running into the room just as Sophie collapsed unconscious onto the floor. But before Daniel could even process what had happened, he noticed fresh blood dripping slowly down his neck, where the blade had already begun to cut his skin. The next morning, nobody spoke about leaving Briarstone Manor anymore. That was the terrifying part. Somewhere between the whispers in the walls, the supernatural visions, and Sophie standing over Daniel with a knife, the family had stopped acting like people trying to escape a haunted house. It was almost as if the house itself had settled inside them, poisoning every thought with fear and confusion. Sophie remembered nothing about the night before. She woke up pale and exhausted, staring at the cuts on Daniel's neck, with genuine horror in her eyes. But even that felt wrong somehow. Too innocent, too disconnected from the darkness growing inside her. Emily wanted to take the children and leave immediately. Yet every time she tried packing their things, something interrupted her. The car battery mysteriously died. The phones lost signal. The storm outside never seemed to stop. Briarstone Manor felt isolated from the rest of the world now, swallowed by endless rain and silence. Daniel became obsessed with understanding what was happening inside the house. He started searching every locked room, every hidden cabinet, every rotten corner beneath the property, desperate to find something that made sense. That's when he discovered the basement wall. Behind a shelf covered in dust and mold, There was an old wooden door hidden beneath layers of black plastic and religious symbols scratched violently into the frame. Some looked like crosses, others resembled warnings. The second Daniel touched the handle, Sophie screamed upstairs. Not cried, screamed. The kind of scream that instantly makes your blood freeze. Emily rushed to calm her while Daniel forced the hidden door open, revealing a narrow staircase descending deep underground beneath Briarstone Manor. The smell rising from below was unbearable. Wet earth, decay, something dead. Flashlight trembling in his hand, Daniel descended slowly while distant scratching echoed through the darkness around him. The tunnel beneath the house stretched farther than it should have, lined with ancient candles melted into the dirt walls. Strange symbols covered every surface, the same symbols Sophie had been drawing for days without explanation. Then Daniel found the photographs, dozens of them hanging from strings like some kind of ritual shrine. Families standing in front of Briarstone Manor across different decades, some smiling, some terrified, but in every single picture, hidden somewhere in the background, stood the same tall woman with hollow black eyes and a twisted neck, watching from the shadows. Daniel's breathing stopped when he noticed one final photograph, lying separately on an old wooden table covered in dried blood. It showed a young girl standing beside the basement entrance sometime in the 1930s, a girl who looked exactly like Sophie, same eyes, same face, same expression, and written across the back of the photo in faded ink were the words, "The veil only opens when the child accepts her." Daniel stumbled back upstairs holding the photograph so tightly his hands were shaking. Nothing about Briarstone Manor felt accidental anymore. The haunted house, the symbols, the voices inside the walls, even Sophie's behavior, it all felt connected to something ancient that had been waiting long before the Harper family arrived. Emily could see the terror in Daniel's face the second he showed her the picture of the girl from the 1930s. For several unbearable seconds, neither of them spoke, because deep down, they both understood the same horrifying possibility. Whatever evil lived beneath that house had seen Sophie before she was even born. That night, the atmosphere inside Briarstone Manor changed completely. The temperature dropped so low, their breath became visible inside the hallways. The lights dimmed constantly, and somewhere above the ceiling, footsteps paced slowly back and forth without stopping. Lucas refused to leave Emily's side after claiming he heard the crying woman whispering through the air vents. But Sophie was the one who frightened them most. She barely spoke anymore. She simply wandered through the house at night like she was following invisible voices nobody else could hear. Around 2 a.m., Emily woke to the sound of Lucas screaming from his bedroom. The scream was so sharp and terrified, it instantly sent Daniel running down the hallway. He threw open the bedroom door and froze in absolute horror. Sophie was sitting on top of Lucas, pinning him against the mattress while holding a large piece of broken glass inches from his face. Her hair hung over her eyes, her lips moving slowly as if speaking to someone standing beside the bed. Lucas was sobbing uncontrollably beneath her. "Sophie," Daniel shouted, stepping forward carefully, but the moment she looked up, something inside her face felt completely wrong. Her eyes looked darker somehow, empty. "If he stays alive," she whispered softly, "she can't enter." Emily rushed toward the bed, but Sophie suddenly lunged at her with violent strength, slashing the glass across Emily's arm before Daniel finally pulled the girl backward. Sophie began screaming instantly, thrashing wildly as though something inside her was fighting to stay hidden. Then every light inside Briarstone Manor exploded at once. Total darkness swallowed the house. The family stood frozen, listening to Sophie's sobs somewhere nearby, while deep banging sounds suddenly echoed through the walls around them. Not outside the house. Inside the walls, slow, violent pounding like dozens of hands trapped beneath the structure were trying to claw their way out. And then, through the darkness, came the sound of a woman crying directly underneath the floorboards. The crying beneath the floorboards didn't stop. It spread through the entire house like something moving underneath them, dragging itself slowly through the walls of Briarstone Manor while the Harper family stood trapped in darkness. Emily clutched Lucas against her chest, blood running down her arm from the wound Sophie had given her, while Daniel desperately searched for a flashlight. But the deeper silence became, the more obvious it was that this supernatural horror was no longer just haunting the house. It was preparing for something. Then Sophie vanished. 1 second she was lying unconscious on the hallway floor after attacking Emily, and the next she was simply gone. Daniel screamed her name through the darkness, while thunder shook the old mansion around them. But only the sound of distant crying answered him back. That was when the grandfather clock downstairs began striking again. 3 slow, deafening chimes echoing through Briarstone Manor, as if the haunted house itself was calling them somewhere below. Daniel knew immediately where Sophie had gone. The hidden tunnel beneath the basement, the place with the candles, the photographs, the symbols, the smell of death buried beneath the property for decades. Emily begged him not to go down there. But then Lucas whispered something that made both parents freeze instantly. She says, if Sophie opens the veil, the house won't need her anymore. The basement door was already open when they arrived. Cold air poured upward from the darkness below, carrying the sound of dozens of whispers overlapping together. Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight and led his family down the narrow staircase, while the walls around them seemed to pulse with moisture and decay. The tunnel looked different now, larger somehow, endless. The candles Daniel had found earlier were all lit, despite nobody touching them, their flames flickering violently as shadows moved across the dirt walls. And then they saw the chamber. Hidden beneath Briarstone Manor was a massive underground room covered floor to ceiling in ritual symbols drawn with dried blood. Hundreds of melted candles surrounded a gigantic stone altar stained black with age. Hanging above it were skeletal remains wrapped in old ropes like grotesque offerings left behind by something ancient and evil. Emily nearly collapsed when she noticed children's drawings scattered across the floor, identical to Sophie's sketches upstairs. Every image showed the same terrifying figure, a tall woman with hollow eyes and a twisted neck weeping black tears. The weeping mother. Suddenly the crying stopped completely. Silence swallowed the chamber. Then Daniel's flashlight flickered toward the far end of the room, revealing Sophie standing motionless beside the altar wearing a long black veil over her face that hadn't been there moments earlier. Her bare feet were covered in blood. "Sophie," Emily whispered through tears, but the girl didn't move. Slowly, unnaturally, her head tilted sideways while the veil slipped from her face. Her eyes were completely black now, not possessed, empty, and when she finally spoke, the voice that came from inside her sounded impossibly deep, ancient, inhuman. "You brought her to me exactly as the house demanded." At that exact moment, every candle inside the ritual chamber extinguished simultaneously, plunging the underground tunnel into absolute darkness, while something enormous began moving through the walls around them. Daniel grabbed Sophie and pulled her away from the altar, just as the walls of the underground chamber began cracking around them. The entire ritual room trembled violently, while horrifying screams echoed through the tunnels. Beneath Briarstone Manor, Emily held Lucas tightly as candles reignited on their own, revealing dark human shapes moving inside the walls like trapped souls trying to escape. Sophie suddenly began crying uncontrollably, her black eyes fading as she whispered, "She's still here," before collapsing into Daniel's arms. Then the altar split down the center with a deafening crack, releasing a wave of freezing air so powerful it extinguished every flame again. For one terrifying second, the family saw her standing in the darkness beyond the chamber, the weeping mother, tall, motionless, watching them silently with hollow black eyes before the tunnel started collapsing around her. Somehow, the Harpers escaped Briarstone Manor before sunrise. Days later, after settling temporarily into a small roadside motel far from Blackwood, Emily finally believed the nightmare was over. But late that night, Lucas slowly looked toward the rain-covered window and whispered, "Mum, why is the crying woman standing outside again?"